Christ is the light of the world, and the darkness shall not overcome it. And we know that's true, but darkness has a way of sneaking around behind and striking us from our blind side. We face evil. Paul says not so much flesh and blood, but the evil powers and principalities, these forces, spiritual forces that are working against the good and the right. And they face us all the time. And Paul uses this analogy of the full armor of God as our way of defending ourselves and battling evil, that we might withstand the wicked days, and that we, when it's all over, remain standing. And so he starts talking about the belt of truth. Now he's not talking about a thin little belt to hold up your pants. He's talking about a cummerbund, if you will, or a wide, thick leather belt that covers the stomach area. This area that's easily penetrated by sharp objects. And evil does that. It gets in under our skin and gets in and disembowels us and takes away our guts. Evil seems so strong. We must be protected by the truth. The truth, as opposed to the untruth, the lies, the stories that come in and disempower us. We must remember the truth of Jesus Christ, who said, I am the truth, and the truth will make you free. Paul goes on to talk about the breastplate of righteousness that protects the heart, protects the emotions, protects our love and our caring. And when evil gets through, it starts to take our heart and our emotions and makes us afraid that we have not been good enough. We have not balanced our sin with our good works. Now, our own righteousness in and of itself is not enough, because we'll never quite balance our sin. But we have a righteousness, a well of righteousness that is infinitely deep and infinitely full, given to us through Jesus Christ, who went to the cross and died for our transgressions. And we can depend on that righteousness, that armor, to know that in God we are forgiven. Paul mentions the boots in order to stand, in order to move toward the gospel of peace. And anybody who's been in the military, been in the infantry, knows that footwear is an important thing. Because without it, you cannot stand and you cannot move forward. It's interesting that Paul is saying to move forward to the peace of the gospel. Paul also mentions the faith of the shield of faith, and how it will quench the flaming arrows, the fiery darts that come at us. And doesn't that happen a lot? Now, there's more to it than just an individual shield. The Romans would form their armies into phalanxes, men standing shoulder to shoulder, holding their 3.5, 4-foot shields up side by side by side until they had an impenetrable box facing the enemy. The only thing the enemy could do was fire burning arrows into them, and the shields would stop those arrows. But you know what happens when your shield gets on fire? The first thing you want to do is put it out. And so you imagine a soldier or two dropping their shield and then trying to stop the fire out, and that breaks the line, and the entire phalanx is vulnerable. You see, the shield of faith is not just individual. It is a community thing. It is us as a church standing side by side with our faith intact. He says that we'll quench the fiery darts. And the Romans would put the their shields in water, soak them in water before the battle so that the leather would soak up the water and the burning arrows would stick, but the flame would sputter out. This talk of arrows also would bring to mind to people hearing Paul of Cupid's arrows, but in the Greek that was eros, and we all know how fiery those arrows can be. It's a beautiful fire when you're young, single, and become infatuated with somebody. It's a wonderful thing in life. But later on, when we've made vows and have families and obligations, and you've probably seen how this happens in the church, we must stand side by side and protect each other with our shields of faith. He goes on to talk about the helmet of salvation. A lot of what happens up in the brain. The breastplate of righteousness covers the heart. It's the helmet of salvation that protects the brain. And it's in our brain where evil does some of its nastiest things. We have often a tendency to move towards despair. Despair is a sin, you know. It's a sin of pride. It's the pride of thinking you know how it's going to turn out. You know what the future's going to be. We're predicting a future, but we don't know what's going to happen next. But we do know what's going to happen next. Because we have the helmet of salvation, because we know that every Friday is followed by Sunday. For everything that goes wrong, even to death, there's always the resurrection. And finally, Paul writes about the sword of the Word of God. This is the first offensive weapon. Because the phalanx sooner or later will have served its purpose, and it's time to take apart the shields and move in and bring the battle one-on-one with the enemy. It's a two-edged sword. It can cut both ways. The Roman sword was called a gladius. It was perfect for that close quarter fighting. But you had to know how to use it. Because you see, the sword is not a weapon you can use like an amateur. You don't just hand a sword to somebody and send them into battle, because they won't last long. It takes practice. It takes discipline. It takes learning how to feint and parry and thrust. And if you don't parry, you will be paired. It takes regular weekly Bible study and Sunday school to understand the Word of God, which is contained in these words about God. To learn how to use this sharp, double-edged sword in our lives. No, the full armor of God is not a foxhole you can just jump in and cover your head and hope for the best. This is an active way to face the evil in life, to withstand in the midst of the battles of life. It takes dedication. It takes discipline. It takes discipleship. It takes remembering that Christ is the light of the world, and the darkness cannot put out the light, but we must let it shine. Remember? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine.